Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Emma McCormick, and on behalf of Praxis, I am happy to introduce Reverend Robert A. Sirico, who received his Master of Divinity degree from the Catholic University of America, following undergraduate study at the University of Southern California and the University of London. During his studies and early ministry, he experienced a growing concern over the lack of training religious studies students receive in fundamental economic principles, leaving them poorly equipped to understand and address today's social problems. As a result of these concerns, Father Sirico co-founded the Acton Institute with Chris Allen Morin in 1990. As president of the Acton Institute, Father Sirico lectures at colleges, universities, and business organizations throughout the U.S. and abroad. His writings on religious, political, economic, and social matters are published in a variety of journals, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the London Financial Times, the Washington Times, the Detroit News, and National Review. Father Sirico is often called upon by members of the broadcast media for statements regarding economics, civil rights, and issues of religious concern, and has provided commentary for CNN, ABC, the BBC, NPR, and CBS's 60 Minutes, among others. In April of 1999, Father Sirico was awarded an honorary doctorate in Christian ethics from the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and in May of 2001, Universidad Francisco Marroquin awarded him an honorary doctorate in social sciences. He is a member of the prestigious Mont Pelerin Society, the American Academy of Religion, and the Philadelphia Society, and is on the board of advisors of the Civic Institute in Prague. Father Sirico also served on the Michigan Civil Rights Commission from 1994 to 1998. Father Sirico holds dual Italian and American citizenship. His pastoral ministry has included a chaplaincy to AIDS patients at the National Institute of Health. He is the pastor of Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Please help me welcome Father Sirico.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be back at Hillsdale. I feel like it's almost bringing coals to Newcastle, right? For me to be talking about these things here at the what is almost a citadel of free market thinking, but I know enough about people who are committed to human liberty to know that that doesn't end debates. It only makes them much more interesting and very often more informed. So hopefully tonight we can have a very frank exchange on a variety of issues. What I have been asked to do is kind of frame the moral case for the free society tonight. And I think that the best and probably the most interesting way I can do that, especially after you've had a nice sumptuous dinner, I want to keep you awake, is to tell it to you in a kind of a parable, except it's not a fictional parable. It's my own story. It's my own journey, how I've come to these ideas, because the guy standing before you now in 2017 is very much not the man who would have been standing here 40 years ago. I have undergone a number of conversions in my life, and as I'm getting to, my senescence and coming to retirement and seeing mortality almost staring me in the face, not quite yet. I want to let my enemies know that I'm still in it for the long haul. But what I begin to see happening is these various strains in my life. I'm reminded here of a quotation from Søren Kierkegaard. He said, "We live our lives forward, but understand them backwards." I'm beginning to see some of the trains come into the station. And these various threads in my life that seem so disparate at an earlier point, I see a certain weaving, a certain synthesis that is emerged. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s. This is not the Crooklyn, Brooklyn. This is not the hipster Brooklyn. This is the Brooklyn of the honeymooners, for those of you who watch YouTube. This is a multi-ethnic experiment that resulted not from a government mandate, but from the fact that people were looking to survive. And I lived on a very busy street called Coney Island Avenue, which I hasten to add is not at the beach. Coney Island is about 3 miles down that way. And this is the heart of, well, I say the heart of Brooklyn because I live there, but you know, everybody in their own neighborhoods would say that's the heart of Brooklyn. But it was really quite a diverse experience because all I had to do was go out my front door and go one way and there was a Polish plumber, or go the other way and on the corner there was a kosher pizza parlor. And my friend's family ran, stereotypically enough, a Chinese laundry across the street, and Puerto Rican friends and black friends. And I didn't know that I wasn't Jewish for about 6 years. I knew something was up because our kitchen smelled differently. So there was that. But so we had this small apartment, which is probably as big as this area of the room. And it was above a toy store. Actually, it's a Lionel train store, if you know what that is. And we had our apartment up there. There was another apartment in the back. And then right on the other side, there were identical apartments. And these two apartments were separated by a kind of, really what it was a roof access, so that you could go out your window, go up and get onto the roof if you needed to repair the roof or something like that. And as I say, there was another apartment directly across from ours. My parents, now remember, this was before the invention of privacy. So my parents didn't have a door on their bedroom. Their bedroom looked out onto Coney Island Avenue. And I had a crib and then a cot right next. I was the youngest of 4 kids in their bedroom. My sister slept on the couch in the living room. And my 2 brothers occupied another small bedroom, which was like the dark hole of Calcutta. It smelled foul, looked foul, bunk beds in there, and I didn't go in. And then there was the kitchen. And as I say, the kitchen looked out to the kitchen across the way. And in that apartment lived Mr. and Mrs. Schneider, an older couple. And I remember one spring day, Mrs. Schneider was at her kitchen window, and she was rolling out some dough. And she had a bowl that she was mixing. What she was making were called rugula. I don't know if you know from rugula, but rugula is a wonderful, I suppose it's an Eastern European pastry, and it's, this particular recipe had walnuts and cinnamon and sugar and raisins and a little bit of flour to give it some, and with butter, and she'd mix this all up, and she'd roll out these pastries, and then she'd cut them into triangles, and she would dollop the ingredients in and roll them into croissants and place them on this cookie sheet. And then she opened her pale green Wedgwood oven and slipped in the rack of rugula, and then she went back to work. Now, I'm watching from my little window into her little window, and this is my perspective of it. I had my hands on the windowsill and watching. I was 5 years old. So this memory I'm telling you about is over 60 years old. And it's like yesterday. In fact, if I pause for a moment, I can smell the rugula. And she was making the rugula. She didn't look at me. She had an apron on. She had this flowered dress with short sleeve. And I just began watching, and these undulating motions, and the rugula in, and the tray comes out, and pretty soon this aroma is wafting across to my windowsill, and I'm just like that, watching her. And at the last time she went to the oven, she pulled out the final tray of rugula, and she placed it on her windowsill, and that's when she looked at me. She said, "You'll come, I'll give you to eat." So I scampered up over my windowsill, and I held out my greedy little hands. Mrs. Schneider took a napkin and she put it over my hands. She began to place these warm, luscious rugula into the napkin in my hands. As she did that, I noticed that on her forearm were a series of blue tattooed numbers. I had no idea what that was. 5 years old, 6 years old. I had no idea what that meant. I was very interested in the arugula. And so I scampered back across and got into my kitchen and immediately hid them from my siblings. Because the Siricos raise no dumb children. My mom came in and I said, Mrs. Schneider gave me some arugula. And got them there. She said, good. I said, Mom, why does Mrs. Schneider have numbers on her arm? Now, I tell you that story because that etched in my mind in such a memorable way. My first lesson in moral theology, anthropology, human decency. And I think it's very telling. Please come right on in. No. Better than an empty room, right? And it was so striking to me at that moment. Here's how my mother responded to my question. My mother didn't finish, I think, 6th grade. And yet what she told me that day and the way she told me it was so memorable that I think it formed, in a way, the intellectual, moral, even political trajectory of my life from that moment to this moment, which isn't to say there weren't a lot of circumlocutions in between. But here's what she said. She said, you know how on Saturday mornings you watch the Westerns? I said, yeah. And she said, the cowboys, what do they go and do? What do they lasso? I said, oh, the cowboys, they lasso the calves. They turn them upside down, they tie them up. She said, and then what do the cowboys do? I said, well, then they take a branding iron and they brand the calf. And she said, and why do they do that? And I said, well, that's so that every other cowboy will know who owns this calf. And she said, yeah, that's what some people did to Mr. and Mrs. Schneider and their whole family. That's what my mother told me. But do you know how much information is encoded in that story? Do you know how many moral points there are in that story? Questions of human dignity, responses of, all of this was being communicated to me because it was something I knew innately. There's something in the human person that recognizes a certain natural law that pervades the universe. And my mother somehow knew to communicate it in that way to me because that seed that she planted has spent all these years unfolding with all of the consequences against varied backdrops. The most immediate backdrops for me in the 50s were the black and white news reports of kids in the South who were not allowed to go into a Woolworths to have lunch at the counter because of the color of their skin. Now, we had Woolworths in the neighborhood, and that was just never an issue in our neighborhood. I don't want to paint the picture that I come from a PC family. I don't. My father was the original Archie Bunker. But the vitriol, the hatred, was what was lacking. The puns, the slurs, all of those things were there about everybody, including other Italians, by the way. But what my mother was telling me now, what she told me then, I began to see, but in different categories. That kind of discrimination, that kind of persecution of people with fire hydrants and guard dogs. And then later on, I remember hearing something about Castro and didn't understand the full thing of what was going on in Cuba, but knew that it was horrible. Probably we had some people in school or something that filled in the backstory on that. And what we called Red China and all of that. And then as my life went on from that lesson, you know, I met many other friends as I grew up whose parents had survived the Holocaust, who had those numbers on their arms. I saw it many, many times. Anybody who grew up in this period of time in New York City saw it. You saw it among your friends, you saw it among your relatives, you saw it among shopkeepers. Strangely enough, at that period of time, none of those people would talk about it. It was, don't ask about that. But as I grew up and saw these various other kinds of circumstances unfolding, whether it's the civil rights movement or various dictatorships that would arise, and I got into the 70s, I have to tell you too that for the period of my teenage years into my mid-20s, I had left my faith. I was raised in a obviously strong Roman Catholic, culturally Roman Catholic home, not particularly devout home. I should also parenthetically pause to just say to you that my brother is an actor who is Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. So you get the flavor of my household. This is not Leave It to Beaver, right? You all go and watch YouTube, and for those of you who don't know what The Sopranos are, you'll see the kind of thick Italian cultural Catholic home that I was in, not particularly pious. I drifted from my faith for a period of about 13 years, and at a certain point, what became my faith, in a sense, my preoccupation, was a sense of social justice. This, of course, is in the 1970s. And by this time, I was living in California and was involved in all kinds of social change movements in California. It was the beginning of the feminist movement. It was the end of the anti-war movement. We had the big boycotts of Gallo grapes and Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, and the beginnings of the gay movement, and all of these social change movements that were going on. And if there was a picket line, I was picketing. If there was a sit-in, I was sitting in. I was involved in all kinds of causes. And as I trace it back now, I think it really had to do with that sense of the indignity with which Mr. and Mrs. Schneider had been treated. And I just kind of translated that. I have to admit to you that I didn't ask a lot of deep questions about that. I was an activist, not a thinker. Thank goodness I was a reader, so that's eventually what would clarify things for me. I remember one day we had been at any number of sit-ins and demonstrations in Los Angeles. It was a hot summer day, and there were a number of picket lines going on. I remember one trick was to have your picket sign with your cause, and then if you had to go to another one, what you did is you just flipped it over, and you did another one, and then if you really had a busy day, you had just a bigger card, so you just flip it open like that. And sometimes the newspaper people would be covering both events. They said, did we just see? No, that was somebody else. To make the cause bigger, blowfish kind of thing. And this day, we were done and came to my apartment, and there were a bunch of us sitting around and talking about, and this is serious, this wasn't a joke, when the revolution comes, what will the world be like? What do we want to see when the revolution comes? You know, we used serious phrases in those days, like, you know the phrase politically correct? Do you know where that comes from? That was a serious Marxist phrase. I remember using it. We would say if somebody wasn't towing the right line, if they were politically deviant in any way, they were politically incorrect. You marked them. It was kind of like they're heretics, you know. And we were there talking about when the revolution comes, and people would say, there'll be this and there'll be that. And my turn came, and I said, always having a flair, when the revolution comes, we'll all shop at Gucci's. Everyone was silent. The smoke stood still in the room. I won't tell you what kind of smoke. I will admit that I inhaled. And my friend was sitting next to me. Her name was Anne. She's the most delightful, I used to call her my little lesbitarian Trotskyite. She was really out there. And she said, and I was a Bob in those days. Bob, what? I said, when the revolution comes, we'll all shop at Gucci's. It's a metaphor. She said, a metaphor for what? I said, well, we want to bring about a revolution where everybody can buy and have access to goods and service at affordable prices. We'll all shop at Gucci's, get it? She said, you're bourgeois. She was right. She said, you're not a socialist. She was right. I didn't understand the cultural depth of what Marxism went. I wasn't an orthodox Marxist. Anne was an orthodox Marxist. She was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And she was the real thing. I was an activist. I wanted to bring about good in the world. I had all kinds of good intentions. I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't a particularly informed person, but I wasn't a bad person. And as fate would have it, or Providence now would have it, I stopped by a friend's house, and he had a visiting friend, a neighbor, somebody near him who I hadn't met before. And we began to talk, and blah, 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 blah. And we walked out of his apartment complex, and we were chatting on the street. I was getting to know this guy, and we stopped in the front. My car was parked here, and there was another car parked in front of me, and I looked at the car, and there were these bumper stickers on the back. And they were all these conservative, right-wing, free market bumper stickers. And I began to mock the idiot who had that car. And this guy smiled. He said, that's my car. I said, yeah. And so we began to have this big, you know, I'm Italian, I'm from New York. If you want to get to know me well, we have to begin with a fight. It's just the way it is. And after a few minutes of this, he said, you are delightfully dumb. He said, I am going to educate you. And I said, yeah, bring it on, bring it on. So this developed a friendship that was really a kind of intellectual sparring friendship, one of the best type that I know. And we would get together and drink and eat, talk, and began talking about all kinds of things. And he came from a whole different point of view from my point of view. And he'd ask me if I'd read this or if I had thought about that. And one day, he asked me a question that got me thinking. He said, what is it you would do to bring about the kind of world that you want to see? What would be one big thing you would do? I said, redistribute the wealth of the whole world. We need to have a massive redistribution of the wealth. He said, okay. He said, now, let's say tomorrow we've done that. We do it, all of the wealth of the world has been redistributed. He said, are you happy? He said, of course I'm happy. Everybody's happy. He said, well, maybe not everybody. I said, oh, okay, so I forget what the percentage was in those days, the 1%, the 2%, whatever it was. Those people are not going to be happy, but the rest of the world is going to be happy. You know, when I wrote this book, Defending the Free Market, in the course of the book, I related this story. And I researched and found, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I researched how much wealth is there in the world. So I got, you know, this isn't any exact science, but I got an estimate of however much it was, and I just divided the number of people on the planet into that number, and it came to about $13,000 per person. Per person, not per family, per person. So for a family of 5, that was nice. For a family of 2, it wasn't as nice. But I said, so everybody will have the same. He said, great. Now that's tomorrow. What happens the next day? I said, what do you mean what happens the next day? He said, well, what do people do? You know, this just world where everybody's now monetarily equal. I said, well, they go to work, and they go, he said, no, wait a minute. They can't go to work. I said, why can't they go to work? Who's stopping? He said, well, you may not realize this, but you just redistributed all of the money in the world, right? I said, yeah. He said, oh, I understand. You think that the wealth of the wealthiest people in the world is in their boats and cars and planes and jewelry and houses. I said, of course, all of these baubles that they collect. He said, no, but that's not the case. The vast majority of the wealth of the wealthiest people in the world is in something called investments. You know what investments are? I had a vague notion. I didn't go to Hillsdale. He said, that's businesses. So if you're serious about redistributing the wealth, that means you have redistributed the businesses, which is really what Marx was about, right? Marx wasn't about the redistribution of this private property in the form of water that I will consume it, and no one else can consume it once it's consumed. He was interested in the form of private property that is called the means of production. So if the salmon is the personal property, the capital, or the means of production, is the net. It's what gives you the property. And if you redistribute all of that, then there are no businesses unless somebody else owns it, which means that it's not redistributed. It's placed at social service, they would say. But in point of fact, that's precisely what a market does anyway. The means of production. There are two kinds of property I came to understand. The consumable property, and the property that is owned privately, but is destined to serve society, or the consumer. And as I began to talk about this with him, and whole new sets of categories began to emerge, I began to see private property as not the ownership of a physical object as such, but of the whole process of one's ability and insight and intelligence and courage to risk going into taking from natural resources, from nature, that which is not yet wealth until it is somehow transformed and placed at human service. This whole process is called a market process, but I never made these connections. And so I kept reading, and I remember one day he came to my apartment. It was a birthday party I was throwing, and he knocked on the door, and I was making something in the kitchen. I said, just come on in. The door's open. He said, I can't, my arms are full. Could you come? And so I came and opened the door, and he walked in with two arms loaded with books. And he walked over to my couch, and he said, happy birthday, Sirico. Read. And he threw the books, scattered them all over the couch. Among those books was The Road to Serfdom by Richard Kayak. Usually I have to stop now at the lecture and explain what that book is. Or The Law by Bastiat. And Socialism by Ludwig von Mises. And Human Action by Ludwig von Mises, but that took me a little while to get into. And Ayn Rand, and Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and all these different, this collection of secular books on economics. I'm coming to the moral part of it. But this is what is so interesting in terms of my story, was that my introduction back to my faith came not through somebody giving me the 4 spiritual laws or telling me to go to Mass or confession, but it was this focus on the economic dimension of human life. And as I began to think more and more about these ideas, I began to think more and more about human beings. Because as you're reading, as I presume many of you know, especially in the Austrian tradition, the Austrian economic tradition, economics is fundamentally a study of anthropology. It's a study of the human person. I think this is what gets people so confused with economics, because usually when you hear about economics, you think of graphs and mathematical equations and all these things, all of which serve a purpose, but they're not at the root. At the root of economics is human action. The root of economics is the human person. It's the subjective value that a person places on something else. And as I'm studying this, I'm thinking about human beings, not just in terms of what they don't have, but in terms of what they can create. And somehow all of these thoughts began to kind of jumble into one another, and I began to recall things that I had heard back in Brooklyn when I went to catechism class. And this nun would teach us about God, about earth, about heaven, about humanity, about man's obligation to other people, about our nature, about our reason. All of these things we are learning in a rote way. Any of you older Catholics remember the Baltimore Catechism. It was just a series of questions. Question, answer, question, answer. Who made me? God made me. Why did God make me? Why did God make me? To love him, to serve him in this world, and to be with him forever in heaven. What constitutes a mortal sin? What's a sacrament? You'd have all of these different things, part of which was this whole understanding of what the human person is. The human person being a combination of a physical reality, a corporeal reality, but also a spiritual dimension. You know, if you think about that, even in just secular terms, you can confirm that. Even if you don't believe in God, certainly you believe in human transcendence in some sense. If you don't believe in human transcendence, then you don't believe that human beings can love, that human beings can appreciate beauty, that human beings can become ecstatic over certain pieces of music, that there's something more to what makes up the human person than the mere physicality of our being, that there's something that has this capacity to cause us to transcend ourselves, to become more than we were before. And then that catechism also told us about the fact that we were individual beings, in some sense autonomous from the first moment of our existence. Certainly that's true and verifiable genetically. From the first moment that a human being comes into existence, his or her DNA is distinct from his mother's. So you're not part of your mother's body. You exist within your mother's body. But that individuality is only seen even more clearly after you're born. But then the Catechism also said something else, that you're not just individual, you're also social. And there you are in the womb relating to your mother. And there you are outside the womb relating to other people. So human beings are a set of things simultaneously, physical and transcendent, individual and social. All of this together constitutes a good grasp of what human beings are. Anthropology, the study of man. Now, as I'm reading these economic questions and these theological, just basic catechetical issues come up, I began to see this confluence, this synthesis, that this is what accounts for the human reality in the world of scarcity. We're in a material world, so right from the Garden of Eden, the economic question has to arise. If you're in a world that is material and scarce, then you have to learn how to allocate those resources. And if you're in a world where you have to relate to others, but you have your own thoughts about things, you have to balance those two dimensions of who you are in the real world. I came to understand all of this over a gradual period of time. The first stage of that took about 6 months. But after about that time, I began to consider these religious questions more profoundly. And I won't go into all of the details of that other than to say that I bumped back into God. And just decided I needed to do something about that. And coincidentally enough, again, providentially enough, there happened to be a priest on my doorstep, a Jesuit no less, a philosopher from Fordham University. Somebody thought these two New Yorkers, especially the one with the Italian name, will be able to relate to a priest. Let him show him Los Angeles. The priest just wanted to see LA, and I had a car, and so I was assigned to show him around, this friend of a friend of a friend of mine. But this priest didn't know what was going on in my life prior to meeting him. And I said, he came to the apartment, I said, well, before we go out to dinner, Father, I would like you to hear my confession. This is a philosopher, Jesuit at Fordham University. What's his first reaction? He looks at his watch. It has been 13 years since my last confession. He looked at his watch again. And I just began to just pour out my heart. The lifestyle I had lived was not acceptable, wasn't acceptable to my family. As I grew eventually in my faith, it became less and less acceptable to me. And I recovered my faith. I have to say I'm still doing the penance all these years later. This is a 40-year-old memory, something like that. And over a longer period of time, as I began to really reappropriate my faith, because I was in culture shock, going back to the church was so different than the church I had left. When I had left the church, Mass was in Latin. It was very devotional. It was very. Now, you had liberation theologians and all kinds of left-wing talk and protests and stuff like this. I had missed this. 13 years of this. It was like culture shock. Over a period of time, though, I discerned to go into seminary and to become a priest, and that's where the shock really hit, because here I am, having been on the streets of California protesting. I'm now in seminary, and I realize that they have taken the politics and the economics of the streets of Hollywood, and it's now in seminary, except they've baptized Karl Marx. This is called liberation theology, various forms of left-wing ideas whereby you would synthesize Christian social teaching with Marxist economics, all with good intentions, the same kind of good intentions I had. Not very well informed. So I began writing about this stuff. Now let me just walk through a basic synthesis, and I'm going to give you, 5 years of theology on this subject in a very condensed form. Let's begin in the Garden of Eden, which I've already alluded to. God fashions man and woman out of the dust of the earth, right? We are this physical being. This world was pronounced good by God. The material world is not evil. The material world is good. And God gives a specific vocation to the human race, to have stewardship over the material creation, to be creative and to be procreative. The first words that God speaks to the newly created human family are words of vocation. Multiply, fill the earth, have dominion. And the whole of the Jewish and Christian faiths are very earthy faiths, if you think about it. It all has to do with building culture, building society, the details on the building of the temple. Jesus becoming man. The redemption, according to Christianity, of the world doesn't take place in an abstraction. The Word was with God, yeah, that's abstract. But the Word becomes flesh. He enters human space, history, time, limitation. He becomes like us in all things except sin. And then the whole life of the Christian church is very earthy. The sacraments are earthy. We use water in baptism. We use bread and wine in Holy Communion. Note, please, not grapes and grain. Bread and wine, what's the difference? Bread and wine has undergone human transformation. Work. Work, by the way, is not a sin. Work was the first vocation given to man before sin enters the world. Work becomes toil as the result of sin. but it's not sinful. It has great dignity. And the whole of the history of the church is this engagement with the world, with the culture. So much so that Christianity, because of its belief in the universal dignity of every human being, and because of its belief in the sanctity of the world, went on to build the great culture of Western civilization. It invented hospitals to care for the sick, because in caring for the sick, you were tending to Jesus in disguise. It built the university systems. Hillsdale is a legacy of that ancient reality. It built universal and organized, systematized charity. Prior to that, people would give alms. Or they'd give alms just to their friends or their tribe. But what Christianity did was to universalize it. Why? Because God was in all people. God loved all people. And the organization comes from the seriousness with which the Christian and the Jewish religions take the real world. All of this began to happen. Even systems of markets emerge not out of economists. Before there were economists, there were moral theologians. I could name them if we had the time tonight. I could name them for you, but you go do your research. Just look up the School of Salamanca in the mid-16th century. These disciples of St. Thomas are pondering moral questions. What are moral questions? Moral questions are questions that have to do with human action, human decision-making, human evaluation. And as they were thinking about all these things, certainly with areas of sexuality, with areas of truth-telling and all the rest, they also had to deal with areas of economy, the limits on the rule of sovereigns and aristocrats. You know, in this 16th century period of time, there are moral warnings against inflation. Inflation. You know how they did that? You know how they came upon the immorality of inflation? If you have a quarter in your pocket, but I'll use this because this has the riches that I want to demonstrate. If you take a quarter out of a dime, you notice on the side of the dime of the quarter there are these little ridges. Have you ever asked yourself what they are? Now this is Hillsdale College. Some of you should know. How many of you know what they're about? That means all the rest of you don't. Okay. This comes from moral reflection, theologians. They said, we are aware that some aristocrats, in taking taxes from people, taking the coins, the silver, the gold, would employ people to sand down the edge of the coin, just a little bit. Not so that if you looked at it you would notice it, but just a little bit. But you do that with one, and you do that with another, and you do that with another. Before long, you're able to form another coin. But all of those other coins have been deflated in their objective value, right? These theologians said that's not moral, that's theft. And questions of supply and demand, questions of, this is again, I'm still in the 16th century, haven't even got to Adam Smith yet. Questions of whether you can charge a market price for something even though you know a ship is coming in with those goods? Yes, you can, because the ship isn't there yet. Or questions of just wages and just prices. Do you know what the scholastics said was the just price? The market price was the just price of the thing. So all of these things I'm beginning to read about and investigate, put together, and now I'm in seminary becoming a priest and realizing that a great part of the Christian tradition has really missed out on its own heritage, and that a lot of what needed to be retrieved were these very basic ideas of the right to private property, which is sacred, without which you can't form a prosperous society. That God, who entrusted man and woman with the care of the earth, also entrusted them with the capacity of reason and insight, to discern the use of things in nature and how to process those things and make them available to others. So that the end, that is the telos, the proper finality of the material goods of the world, is for the benefit of all people. That's not a socialist invention. That's a Christian invention. And it doesn't need to be implemented socialistically by government bureaucrats, because the market does that quite naturally. Now, let me say, because I just have a few moments before I want to conclude here and open it up to what I hope will be a robust exchange. Let me say that in saying that the free society and the free economy have great moral potential, I am not saying that the free economy or the free market, or freedom for that matter, automatically guarantees virtue. Freedom's a vacuum. It's not a virtue. It's an empty space that needs to be filled by something. You can fill it by sin, or you can fill it by sanctity. The choice is ours. But without that freedom, sanctity becomes a little more difficult. Heroes are heroes because they choose heroic actions. Freedom, when oriented to the truth, can become a moral enterprise. So that people in business who discover the use of resources and transform those into wealth, which only make profits to the extent that they serve the needs of other human beings who are willing to pay for the use or the possession of those products, that enterprise, that human action, can be a moral action that benefits the vulnerable. You and I have hit the lotto in living at this point in history and in this place on the globe. In fact, just to be living at this point in history on almost every place on the globe is to have hit the lotto, because we are living at the richest point in terms of material prosperity of any society ever in history before. Now you know that. And yet it's so easy to take that for granted. It's so easy to take for granted indoor plumbing or indoor air conditioning. It's so easy to think that the world has always been like this, but it hasn't always been like this. When I moved to Michigan, I was at a house for a while. It was a religious community I was living in. And I was sitting out on the porch, and I noticed out in the near the house there was this tree. It went up 3 stories. And I noticed the top of the tree. I'm from Brooklyn. What do we know from trees, right? It was one in Brooklyn once. Somebody got it. And I noticed at the top of the tree there was this bloom, and there were these dead leaves. So we called a tree doctor. I thought he was going to arrive with a stethoscope. Anyway, he came and he knocked around and he looked at the roots and looked at the leaves and picked at the bark, and he came up on the porch where I was sitting and he said, "The tree is dead. You got to take it down." I said, "What do you mean the tree is dead? It's in bloom. Half of it's in bloom." He said, "It's an illusion." I said, "What do you mean it's an illusion?" He said, "The sap is working its way through the tree, through the trunk of the tree. But each year there's less and less sap." He said, "So this tree, which has been dead for a while, is really weak. And in one of these Michigan winters, this tree can blow down on your house." He said, "We've got to take it out." That's the metaphor for the way people think about our society today. We think we can just live off of what was produced at a past era. But what we really need to do is tend to the roots. I don't think the roots of our society are dead yet, because places like Hillsdale still exist. But if we don't tend to the roots, that is to say, if we don't tend to what made for so prosperous and liberal a society in the truest sense of that word, we will not have the tree at all. And boy, will that be a dark night. Lord Acton said that liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. Liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. I hope that you understand the delicacy of what you hold in your hands. What you hold in your hands not only for yourself, but for your children and your children's children. And that you tend to those roots. You understand what made for so free and prosperous and decent and moral and liberal a society, a culture, and help to fortify it against the well-intentioned, but not too bright, forces that would tear it down. Thank you very much for your attention. So we have some time, we have to be out of here, okay. Yes.
I've got a comment and a question.
Okay.
First, I would say, my name is Mike Sweeney. I've been teaching here, this is my 21st year here at Hillsdale, and I've been teaching full-time since 1980. I've seen a lot of teachers. You're one of the best I've seen. I've got a question for you. I've been Catholic in and out for a long time, and
I have sympathy with that.
yes, I related a lot to
Recovering Catholic.
Yes.
Are you, but just tell me, are you on your way in or out?
Yeah.
Oh, you're on your way back in,
Yeah.
okay.
How are you accepted by the church in general? That's my question.
You know, people ask me, sometimes I hear the question in this way, what does the Vatican think of you? And I never know how to answer that, because the television view of what the church is and the Vatican is one unit, one voice. And that's not my experience of the church. The Acton Institute, which I founded in 1990, which really kind of institutionalizes in a lot of ways everything you've just heard me say in a very kind of condensed way, is ecumenical. So we deal from Mormons to Muslims, you know, and everything in between. Mostly evangelicals and faithful Catholics and a growing chunk of Eastern Orthodox Christians. I have found that we have critics within the church, within the Vatican, and in some very high places in the Vatican. We also have real supporters in those places. Now, we've worked at it for almost 30 years, very strategically. So if I were here in 1990 talking to you, I might have been at Hillsdale in 1990 talking, I don't remember, I would have felt much more besieged than I do now. Part of it is that I'm going to retire soon. Frankly, my dear, I don't care. I mean, I care theologically. You know, I'm a man under authority, my bishop and all that. What I mean I don't care anymore is I have my social network. I have my affirmation basket, you know, and that's a lot of what people worry about. What do they think of me? I was with my bishop. I said, I know these priests don't like me. A lot of them don't like me. A lot of the young ones do. I said, but it doesn't stop me from sleeping at night. You know, I'm just doing what I'm doing because I really believe in it. It was a greater risk, and for those of you who are younger, when you're building a career, when you're looking to your future, what people think about you is a lot more important when you're younger than when you get older, because then you have your friends and stuff. So if you mean on a social level, on a professional level, it balances itself out. And I think we're winning. I think we're winning because I think the younger people, the dynamics between the Catholic reality and the Protestant reality is somewhat different. I think right now, there's a real move toward not only various forms of collectivism and socialism among the evangelical young, but also a kind of de-Christology among some of the megachurch movements, kind of emergent church stuff that that is trying to kind of dilute the gospel. So that's one dynamic that's going on over there. Among younger Catholics, it's the opposite. And I think that's the legacy of St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI. That you can talk to a priest who's been ordained in the last 10, maybe even 15 years, and almost to a man, he is going to be faithful in prayer, orthodox in his belief, and pretty well open to the free market and the free society. We have to do something about our evangelical brothers, and we're doing that. The Acton Institute has put out a plethora of material. We work with seminary professors from the largest evangelical seminaries in the country, so we're trying to reverse that. But when I started, it was just the opposite. The evangelicals were the more free market conservative, and the Catholics were the more liberal activist types. So that's the reality as I see it at this point after doing this for almost 30 years.
Thank you so much for your talk, Father. I agree. It was really great. My question is, so I understand what you're saying as far as having freedom enables us to make moral choices because you can't make a moral choice without freedom. I recall reading an article a while ago in the Wall Street Journal that said something essentially to the effect of, it's better to buy a yacht than give money to charity because by putting your money into this yacht, you'll kind of start all these wheels in motion within a free economy that will end up benefiting people more than giving to charity. But my understanding of Catholic teaching is that we as individuals should choose to give to charity rather than to buy ourselves yachts. So like, what would be your perspective on kind of how the individual should
Well,
on how like the individual should make choices?
Sure.
That
Let's talk about that because that's an excellent question because wrapped up in this question are a number of things. First of all, let's clarify something from just an economic point of view, and that is if we're concerned about the poor, then we're concerned about the poor. We want to find a way that the poor can get out of poverty, right? The kind of smuggled in assumption to that moral premise which I agree with obviously, but the economic assumption smuggled in there, or the moral assumption smuggled in there, is that the way we get the poor out of poverty is by charity. Now think about that for a moment. The last 200 years, we have seen the greatest rise out of poverty in all of the world, ever. Was that due to charity? Was that due to the beneficence of the Vatican charitable arm? Mother Teresa? CARE? Government-to-government aid programs? None of it. None of it. It was due to the globalization of markets. People rise out of poverty because they have access to work. That is a productive economy. So, that's not to say we shouldn't be doing something with charity, because charity is necessary even more than for the person who receives it, than for the person who gives it, okay? But also for the person who receives it, if we understand what we're doing when we give it. And I think we're very dumb in our charitable choices very often. We think if we give this money, we're going to make this person not poor. Or that we should just give money to do that. I think we need to be much more strategic and much more intelligent about it. Let me tell a story. When I was in seminary, we had to do work with poor, various kinds of work. And I was assigned with a classmate of mine to go into the inner city of Washington, D.C., Anacostia. And there was a Baptist church that let this nun use their basement once a week on Fridays. And she would set up this soup kitchen. She was brilliant in the way she did it, very entrepreneurial in the way she did it. She wrote to all of the women's auxiliary organizations in various churches, Baptist, Presbyterian, Catholic, Methodist, whatever. And she said, here's a recipe for this week. Could you make X number of portions of food? So Mrs. Smith would make 10, and Mrs. Jones would make 10, and Mrs. whoever would make 10, and from that one congregation, they get enough chili to serve X number of people, and then each week, another church would take a turn doing that. And the sister would have all this stuff down there. I think they sent their chauffeurs from Chevy Chase, with, you know, gave the recipe to their maids, and the maids maybe, you know, whatever, however it happened. The seminarians came, we were the muscle. We set up the chairs and the tables in the Baptist basement, and we put out the food. And when we went there, the sister said, now remember, whosoever will may come. Anybody comes, we feed them. We don't ask any questions. Okay. So we set it up, and I remember one day I was going to dump some garbage out. These two ladies arrived in a taxi cab and were rushing down basement. I followed them down. They said, you work here? I said, yeah. She said, could you get us in the front because we've got to go, there's a sale. We're going to go shopping. And could you get us in the front of the line? I don't remember what I did. But I just, something bugged me about that, and I wasn't quite sure right at the moment what it was. But whosoever will may come. We're not going to ask any questions. We never asked anybody to do anything. We closed up one day. It happened to be a Friday in Lent, so we couldn't meet that Friday. We would eat with the folks. But the good Baptists sent chili con carne, so we didn't eat. So I said, you know, by the time we get back to the seminary, the nuns are going to have closed the refectory. So there's a little fish and chips place right over here on the corner. Let's just go down before we head back. So we walked in this fish and chips place. I walk in, and there's this young girl in her teens sweeping out the restaurant. This guy came over. I'm kind of sizing them up, you know. This is father and daughter, and I looked in the kitchen where he put the order in, and there was the mother frying up the chips and the fish. I turned to my friend Joe, and I said, Joe, you know what just hit me? I'm almost afraid to mention this. He said, what? I said, we're this people's competition. We're the competitors of this family. He said, what are you talking about? I said, we run a restaurant once a week in their neighborhood. He said, are you crazy? We're giving away food to the poor. I said, yeah, but we don't pay for the food. We don't pay for the electricity. We don't pay for the labor. We don't pay any insurance. We don't pay any taxes. And once a week, people have a choice to come to us and eat for free and not be asked to do anything. Or come here and spend $3. Those days, that's about what it costs for that lunch. And they're going to, we're making life more difficult for these people. He said, you are crazy. I said, I'm just trying to think sensibly about this. I think this touches on what you're saying. Sometimes, now, what am I advocating? I told this story once. Maybe I wasn't cautious enough in the way I was telling it because the news report came out that I was in favor of closing down soup kitchens. And that wasn't at all. That wasn't my point at all. My point is that we need to engage people. Not just see people as passive recipients of my generosity. Well, that makes me feel great. You know, what does that do for them? Let's first understand that charity is not the normative way that people rise out of poverty. That's the first thing we need to understand. Charity is not only justifiable, it is mandatory, morally, when there are emergency situations that come up. But it's not the normal way that people rise out of poverty. And when we engage people in charitable acts, especially able-bodied people who have choices to make, as those two women, the importance of those two women who were going shopping, what I finally teased out was they're making a set of choices. And it is better for them to eat at our place than at the fish and chips place, basically. What I'm saying is we need to engage people more intelligently and see people, even people who are poor, even people who are handicapped, even people who are marginalized, as the first source of their own amelioration. We need to see them as subjects of their own destiny, not beneficiaries waiting for us to come in and give them something. And so what I'm saying is, on a moral level, we are called to be generous from out of our means, even from out of our want, but not in such a way that we destroy our family, the well-being of our family, or destroy the whole economy as such. So I think there is a case to be made to say that systemically, engaging in the economy, and you don't just engage in the economy, by the way, by buying consumer goods, by buying yachts. I'm not a yacht person, but if you want to take me out on your yacht, I'm willing to go. It's not the thing I would buy if I had a lot of money. But that's not the only way you engage in the economy, though I can understand the point that the yacht builders and all the associated businesses around building a yacht, docking it and maintaining it and all that, does provide money. But there's also investment, which isn't charity. You know, Maimonides, great medieval rabbi, has this, I think he called it the ladder of charity, and he has these just more and more moral forms of charity. And giving to that soup kitchen, or even running that soup kitchen, is one of the levels of charity, but it'd be down here. Maimonides' top two are charity that is given anonymously, and charity that renders the recipient independent from your charity, i.e. providing a job, or something like that. So I think it is complex, and I do think, as Christians, we have a moral obligation to the poor, both because the poor are vulnerable, and God's heart inclines toward them, but also because that's where we're going to encounter Christ. We are going to receive more than we will give. A very wealthy man once I was talking to him, he was talking to me about his spiritual life. He wanted to do something, and he was asking, you know, what do I do to deepen my spiritual life? Very successful I am. And I said, why don't you go down and work at the soup kitchen once a month? He said, Father. He said, how long is the shift at the soup kitchen? I said, I would imagine 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours if you do the whole thing. He said, do you know how much money I can make in 4 or 5 hours? And if I just did that and gave it to the soup kitchen, wouldn't that be better? And I said, oh, you misunderstood me. I wasn't talking about doing something for those people. I was talking about doing something for you to do that. So there's some intangible things that can't be analyzed economically, though there are a lot more things that can be analyzed economically than we admit. And bringing our intelligence to bear in our charitable giving, in our investments, in how we treat people, how we allocate it, and whether we allocate it at the most local level first rather than going to the federal level first, all of those things are moral considerations in the question of charity. One more question? You'll throw me out of here when you're ready. No? Any more questions? Yes. We'll make this the final.
Thank you for your talk. It's very good. I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship between freedom and the individual's ability to use freedom wisely, particularly in relation to the virtue that would be required for that freedom.
Well, I think this is a matter of, yes.
And I'm sorry, the relation of the government and its duty or its obligation to make its people capable of freedom.
Right. I thought that's where I was going to include that because that's where the rubber hits the road. I don't see the government as the first or normative formator of virtue. I think the government has a role to project a certain norm. Certainly, the function of government is to prevent people from hurting other people, from robbing other people, killing other people, and all the rest of it. And then I think there is a kind of boundary, a tone that the government has some role in, but it's mostly a negative role. That is, it removes the things that don't allow for virtue. It removes the obstacles toward virtue. That the real engine of human formation, of human flourishing and virtue, is the family first and foremost, and then all of the other cultural entities, like the church and like the mediating societies, like systems of mores and etiquette, that through their authority, which is a form of constraint that is interior to the person, as opposed to power, which is a form of constraint that is exterior to a person. That's government. This is these other norms and mores. By the way, that distinction I just made is from Robert Nesbitt, the authority and power. I love that. I wish I could rob it from him, but he said it, and I said, yeah, that's right, that's right. He said it. When you have this as the normative way in which the culture is formed, I think you have far more reliable. De Tocqueville said, I just quoted it earlier tonight when we were having a conversation. De Tocqueville said something to the effect that, how shall we escape so great a destruction if, as the moral tie is weakened, the political tie is strengthened? And that's exactly what's happening in our society today. I don't think that all of this heat and anger and adamance and petulance about PC standards, which is in its ferocity is as puritanical as any Puritan ever was. But it's all about things that don't require personal virtue. You know, they're external things. You have this phenomenon in our society now that language, even unintended language, becomes charged morally and politically in the minds of people who really don't care about moral standards anymore, as traditionally defined. What I'm saying is that when you have the reality that in our schools, a child can receive a condom or an abortion referral without a parent's permission, but cannot receive a copy of the New Testament with their parents' permission, that you have something going wrong in society in terms of where the moral question really lies. So while I think that the state has a function, I'm not an anarchist, I think it is a very limited function, and I think its most important functions pertain to the courts and to defense, either international defense or police forces and the court system. And that the normative structures of society should begin at the lowest level, because that's where people have the most impact either way. This is what we call in the Catholic tradition the principle of subsidiarity, that needs are met at the most local level, and you only go up to higher levels of social organization when there's a manifest failure at the more local levels. And I think we've got that just inverted right now. If something needs to be done in society, we need to have the Department of Education to do it. You know, like, if you abolish the Department of Education tomorrow, there will be no education of children in this country. None. Everyone will go around and graduate from high school and not be able to read their diplomas. Oh, no, wait. That happens now. But, I mean, this is just a pervasive assumption that if the government isn't doing it, it's not going to get done. And I think this is exactly the wrong way. What we need, and I'm sorry, I wish I had a way to advocate for this whole thing to be over in the next election cycle, but it's not. What is happening is a culture that needs to be put back together, holy. And as I say, this has been 2,000 years in the making. And the problem is it's not going to be solved by an election cycle. And now we have a bull in the china shop, and I hope that he breaks up the china shop real good. My question is, what do we put together after the china shop? And I'm not sure that we are morally or philosophically or intellectually capable yet of thinking that through as an American society, because we don't share a lot of those values that we used to share. And values that were transcultural, values that were trans-ethnic. They were not even economically based values. There were people, I mean, we held the same values in our home as wealthy people in Manhattan did on the Upper East Side, for the most part. We spoke the same kind of moral language with Mrs. Schneider or Mrs. Rabinowitz as we did in our own home. There was a certain common grammar that is missing, and that's what we need to reconstitute. And I'm sorry, that is not going to be, this is why institutions like the Acton Institute, like Hillsdale College, and like a lot of our kissing cousins are so essential for bringing back this vision of what society should look like.
May I ask one more question?
Sure. I'll give you an
On a
indulgence.
parish level,
Yes.
all these things you're talking about, do you envision or have you in some way accomplished within your parish some of these things that engage the community and even the people within your church to not only think about these things, but to make them happen at that level? Because I kind of see that that's the only way it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think we need a lot of these little platoons, a lot of them. So Hillsdale and Acton, one. I'm a priest first and foremost, and I'm a pastor of a parish. And 5 years ago, I inherited this parish with a school that had 68, 69 kids. That was moribund. It was typical. It was a Catholic school imitating the public school system. It had 3 teachers in the school, which was about a fourth or a third of all the teachers in the school, who were there by an exchange program, so that they were public school teachers. I don't know why they call it exchange. I think they call it exchange. But they come in, and the public school will give you these 3 teachers, so they pay all of their costs, their salary and everything. And all you have to do is rent them the classroom, remove all of the religious items, and these 3 teachers, we determine what the subjects are that we need help in. I forget what it was, math, gym, art, something. But I had no, I came in, I had no choice in the teachers. And I said, no, we can't do that. We'll pull a Hillsdale on. And so I fired the teachers, which meant we had to make up those salaries. I also entered the federal lunch program because it was a pain in the neck, and our kids just didn't want to eat kale. They just didn't. And the dietitian said to me, she said, I spend 2 weeks a year filling out these forms. And I forget how much money it was. I said, well then, of course, the question was, what are the kids going to eat? I said, well, who's going to feed the kids? I said, their parents. I said, if you have a kid whose parents aren't going to feed them, send them over to the rectory. I always had peanut butter and jelly and tomato soup, which was my favorite lunch growing up. Nobody's ever come. Now, that's 5 years ago. We went to a classical model. We rejected all government subsidies. We've had a little bit of a, please turn this off, a little bit of a battle with the bureaucracy, but the bishop has backed us completely. We also have hired, I don't know how many Hillsdale grads to our not our headmaster, our provost is a graduate here, Zach Good, and a number of our teachers, I keep thinking they're students when I look at them. I realize, oh, they're not students, they're teachers. And we've gone to a complete classical model of education. We kids learn Latin from Montessori, and I mean a real Montessori class, right up, now we've started a high school. We're 2 years into a 4-year high school, Sacred Heart Academy. Go online and see it. We now have about 300 students in that school in 5 years, and we've grown 300%, and expect this trajectory to continue for another 3 to 5 years. These kids are involved in caring for people, learning Mass every day. Did I say that? Mass every day, and not a kids' Mass. I find kids' Mass boring. It's an adult Mass where these kids are learning their faith. All our kids can chant the Our Father in Latin. Anybody here can chant the Our Father in Latin? You have to come to you. And we're engaged in 1,000 different ways with our community, with the poor. One of the things that tells me that the culture is being formed is the way they deal. We have two special needs kids in the school. Now, you know, with special needs kids, very often there's a bullying problem. The exact opposite. Our kids are around those kids and protective of those kids and incorporate those kids in what they do. And when they go to confession every month, when they go to confession, they'll tell me, I left somebody out of playing, and I should have, you know, and they're morally sensitive and conscious. Give me 15, 20 more years of this, and you're going to have an army of people who are going to take over industries and schools and rectories and do what you're saying needs to be done. I never had a school. This is the first school I've had in my whole career as a priest. I don't know anything about education. What I'm smart enough to do is get people who do know how to do it. And if I can do it, anybody can do it. I really believe it. Now, you do it differently than the way I did it in the west side of Grand Rapids, which isn't the fancy side of Grand Rapids, by the way. The DeVosses don't live in our neighborhood. They visit. They send security first. They scout it, then they come in and out. Anyway, the point is, this can be done. The most needed thing is the right set of ideas. You get the right set of ideas, and you can get people to work with you to do it. You really can. So there are a lot of obstacles in our way to do this. And I invoke the name DeVos. Let's hope that she closes it down. That's what I sent her a text message. And I said, congratulations on your appointment. Shut it down. Thank you for your time.